They've taken advantage of other people representing this country, and they're not going to do that any longer.
A large part of Apple's components are in semiconductors, so we would like to have Apple help us make the semiconductor supply chain more secure.
Under the leadership of the extraordinary President Donald J. Trump, we will make America healthy again, and what an honor it is to be a part of that.
Hello, everyone. I'm Major Garrett in Washington. Tonight on the final edition of America Decides. Stop me if you've heard this before. New tariff threats. President Trump warns Apple, the company, that it could face a 25% tariff, and he warns the European Union it could face tariffs of up to 50%. Those threats coming after the president met with Apple CEO Tim Cook earlier this week. The demand, make your iPhones here or pay a pretty stiff price. Also, White House officials say they're unhappy with the pace of negotiations with the European Union. President Trump said talks with the 27-nation bloc were, quote, going nowhere. We start tonight with Nancy Cordes at the White House. So, Nancy, you asked President Trump in the Oval Office about Apple and these tariffs. What did he say?
Well, Major, he said that these tariffs are actually going to go into effect at the end of this month. And he also argued that this is what has to happen in order to force Apple to move its production back to the United States. But I asked him why he would want to hurt a U.S. company, actually the third largest U.S. company, in this way. Take a listen to what he had to say.
It would be more. It would be also Samsung and anybody that makes that product. Otherwise, it wouldn't be fair. So anybody that makes that product, and that'll start on, I guess, the end of June.
So basically, Major, what he's trying to do is to pressure Apple to move its production to the U.S. more or less immediately, even though Apple CEO Tim Cook has said time and time again that, first of all, the U.S. simply doesn't have the pool of skilled workers with the particular skills needed to make the iPhone in numbers large enough to be able to make millions of iPhones here in the United States. And outside analysts have estimated that making the iPhone in the U.S., even if that workforce was available, would end up tripling the cost for American customers from, let's say, $1,000 right now up to $3,000 or even $3,500.
And Nancy, I want to play for you sound from the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, about overall climate, because as you know, a couple of weeks ago, there was all this optimism from Trump administration officials about these trade deals that were right on the verge of being settled. Well, let's listen to the Treasury Secretary now.
I've said there are 18 important trade deals that we have to do. I'm working mostly on Asia, and that group has move forward with some very interesting proposals. They're negotiating in good faith. We've already inked a deal with the UK. I think there are a couple more coming in the near future. So I think this is in response just to the EU's pace.
Things are still in process, it sounds like, and slower than certainly they were talking about a couple of weeks ago.
Right. They were talking about 90 deals in 90 days. Instead, the only deal that's been announced so far is one with the UK, where the U.S. has a trade surplus, so it was easier to get that deal done. Part of the challenge has been that some of the president's expectations and his demands keep shifting, which makes it difficult to sit down at the negotiating table. For example, Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, he knew that the president didn't like that iPhones were being made abroad, that he viewed this as a symbolic weakness. And so back in February, in order to mollify the president, Cook announced that Apple was going to be investing $500 billion over the next 4 years in building up the U.S. workforce, in building new U.S. plants, and moving semiconductor production here to the U.S. And if he thought that that would be enough for President Trump, those hopes were short-lived, because apparently the fact that the president was hearing that Cook was looking at moving some production to India from China, it really set him off. And so he issued this early morning post on Truth Social today saying that he's going to slap this 25% tariff on iPhones. Or
negotiate in the in-between. Nancy Cordes at the North Lawn of the White House. Thanks so much. So it's being called the art of the ambush or something like that. From South Africa's president this week to Ukraine's Zelensky back in February and a couple of heads of state on the in-between. Is this the new norm for world leaders that they have to navigate when they come to the Oval Office? Here to take a deeper dive on that pretty important question, Ravi Agrawal, friend of the show. He's also, importantly, editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy magazine. Ravi, it's great to have you with us. So is this something that heads of state have to prepare for, not just the brief that they're preparing to discuss with the president and his top advisors, but this idea that if you come in the Oval Office, you could be, whether you wish to be or not, part of an international spectacle?
Oh, absolutely. Everyone has seen what happened with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, and they want to avoid a similar sort of spectacle where they're dressed down to. Look, I think foreign leaders now, both from Trump's first term, but especially now with what they've seen over the last few months of an array of leaders coming to the United States, they've seen what it takes to work with Trump. He likes a good deal. He likes flattery. That worked very well for the UK's Keir Starmer, for example, who came with a letter from the king and was very clear in saying that no one's ever had two state visits before. This is a big deal. And Trump clearly liked that. But on the other hand, if you're coming from a country that Trump doesn't like, or if he has some beef with you, as he did with South Africa, as he did with Ukraine, then good luck. I mean, it's really a choice between not coming at all or coming with enough sort of sweeteners and honey to really put him off his guard.
And Ravi, about the South African visit this week, something happened in the Oval Office in which the president was very loose and cavalier with a definition that before the United Nations, even with the Trump Justice Department, has specific meaning: genocide. What he described in South Africa demonstrably isn't. How did you evaluate that particular moment?
This was surprising, even by the standards of this White House, in that they fell for a conspiracy theory that is peddled by some people in South Africa, but a very fringe minority, but then also elements of, the far right kind of internetverse, as it were, where these are claims that there is a white genocide underway in South Africa. There is no truth to it. And, lots of data shows that, while South Africa does have a lot of crime, that crime affects both whites and blacks fairly equally. And of course, whites are disproportionately wealthier in South Africa. So for Ramaphosa, this was a shock to see. And it was very clear that this was a setup. It was an ambush. It was also a TV moment for the cameras, with the lights turned down, video ready to go. And in many senses, even though Ramaphosa brought with him, for example, two famous South African golfers, Ernie Els and Retief Goosen, thinking that Trump would like their presence, even then he sort of fell into this trap. And I should point out for your viewers, Ramaphosa is a storied diplomat. He was also part of the talks that led to the end of apartheid in his country. And so he may have thought that he could match Trump. But of course, in that setting, in the Oval Office, Trump had his way, and it looked really bad for all sides, frankly.
And in the aftermath, I want to play some sound from the South African President Cyril Ramaphosa about questions that he got in the Oval Office after the president made that presentation and played so loosely with the terminology around genocide. Let's listen.
When he was asked by one of you, and thank God one of you asked, whether he was convinced that there was genocide, he says, no, he's not convinced. Much as he flighted the video and all those press clippings. And in the end, I mean, I do believe that there is doubt and disbelief in his head about all this.
And Ravi, that just seems to underscore the necessity that world leaders have to bring in interactions with the president, that you may have to spend time and effort talking him out of things that simply aren't true and that weren't part of the original discussion space in the first place.
Exactly. It also, again, raises the question, should you come to the White House for a meeting like this? If you are Xi Jinping in China, do you really want to put yourself in that position? And we now have a lot of examples. You have leaders from Japan, India, Italy, South Africa, Ukraine, El Salvador, and there's a range of examples of what works and what clearly doesn't. Probably the UK had the best experience, mostly through flattery, and then Ukraine and now South Africa have had the worst. But in the middle are countries like India and Japan, which Trump realizes the United States needs good relationships with. So some of it is down to just what Trump sees as in America's interests or his personal interests. But there's also an element of race here, and him playing that card with a South African leader who is Black and telling him that there is a white genocide underway, which is not true. And there are several links here as well to prominent white South Africans like Elon Musk who have retweeted similar claims, even though they've been debunked. So that sound you played is revelatory if Trump genuinely doesn't believe it, but may have just been playing to the gallery of his most fervent supporters.
There is a gallery out there, to be sure. Ravi Agrawal, always great to have you. Thank you, sir.
Pleasure.
We learned Sunday that President Biden was diagnosed with an aggressive form of prostate cancer. Yesterday on this show, I was joined by the co-author of Original Sin, which accuses the former president and many of his closest advisors of covering up his cognitive and physical decline. For more on this conversation, I want to bring in our Executive Director of Elections and Surveys, Anthony Salvanta, to help us look back at our own CBS News polling related to questions surrounding the president's bid for re-election. Anthony, based on our data, what can you tell us about the public awareness as we were able to sift it about any concerns about his ability to carry out a second term or decline?
Hey there, Major. Look, I think what you do here is you get context, and I think it's important to separate the personal and the political. Well, let me start with the political, by which I mean this. At the time that Joe Biden announced that he was running for re-election, you found a sizable, this chart is among Democrats, from April of 2023. And you find a sizable number, 45%, who said they didn't think he should run. But the real second beat on this that shows some of those underlying concerns, if you will, was that when I followed up and asked them why they thought that, if they did, the top answer was his age. And always in politics, you might get this feeling that, get somebody new, et cetera. But it was that his age part that really stood out. And if you dig a little deeper into this, and that never abated, by the way, I should say, when we got into the fall and we asked things like, what do you think would happen if, in this case, either candidate were elected, you saw that a lot of voters didn't think that Joe Biden would finish a second term if he were to be elected to one. And what that did was it created a lot of uncertainty there, right? What do you get if you vote for somebody? So that was kind of lingering as well. And I'll note this, it also had implications, I think, across other elements of policy, Major. Even when we asked to describe the candidates, this is in the summer of 2024, before Joe Biden dropped out. He had big deficits on descriptions, things like energetic, things like effective, that maybe, in fact, if you see some correlations, were related to some of those suspicions. I will add this, though. It wasn't just particular to Joe Biden in general, because you often see when we ask if legislators should serve over the age of 75, a lot of voters tell you that it does raise concerns about their job ability in general, Major.
And just to underscore what you said at the top, Anthony, even in 2023, there were ways we could look at the data and see simmering concerns among Democrats, those most theoretically aligned with the president, about his ability to serve and serve through the future.
Yes. And in fact, if I jump to June of 24, and there were other measures that we looked at, like, do you think, in this case, either candidate had the mental and cognitive health to serve as president, I would point out this. You get almost a third, you get almost 3 in 10 Democrats who did not think that Joe Biden did. And so that was large. Look, it was larger among Republicans, but it was large among independents as well. That's the political side of this, as much as it is then those concerns generally about his overall health. And I should also add this, Major. You don't want to talk about movement on this. In particular, it was after that first debate where we saw a dramatic move in the numbers overall that I just pointed out. So that's a little bit of the context. That's the personal assessment, the suspicions about what was happening, and also the political.
The data helps us tell the story, and Anthony helps us tell the story the data tells. Anthony, always a pleasure. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Trump administration is touting spending cuts in the House-approved budget bill, but a nonpartisan analysis of that bill calls it a fiscal failure. More on that next, right here on America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. As you might remember, 1 week ago, we devoted the entire hour of this show to the House bill carrying the Trump economic agenda. That bill passed this week in the House. And I want to quickly summarize some of its key components. It renews the Trump tax cuts of 2017. It raises the standard deduction from $1,000 to $2,000, also raises the deduction limit from $10,000 to $40,000 for state and local taxes. It also eliminates federal taxes on overtime and tips, eliminates taxation on interest for auto loans for American-made, that's important, American-made cars. It also increases the standard deduction by $4,000 for Americans 65 and older. There are also some spending reductions. Medicaid down by nearly $700 billion, food stamps down $267 billion, and $64 billion in other assorted cuts. All of this over the next decade. Now, 7.6 million Americans would lose Medicaid coverage, 1.4 million due to changes related to eligibility linked to their legal status. Those are some of the granular specifics. For the big picture on deficits, debt, and spending trends, let me welcome back to our program Maya McGinnis, president of the Nonpartisan Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. Maya, you with me at this table last Friday. Talk to me about what this bill is, what it isn't, and the implications for those worried about the increasing debt load of the United States.
Yeah, thank you, Major. Nice to be with you again. And there are even more reasons to be worried about that debt load, just given the past week where markets continued to be concerned. So as you went over, this is a bill that extends tax cuts, expands tax cuts, creates new tax cuts, adds spending, does have some offsets, but not nearly enough to fully cover the cost of the bill. So all told, if you're looking at this from a fiscal perspective, it would add about $3 trillion to the national debt at a time where we should clearly, by all accounts, be reducing that debt, not increasing it. On top of that, there's some real concerns. It's very front-loaded in all the borrowing and very back-loaded in all the savings, which is a trick we all know very well. So even just in the first year that everything would be fully implemented in 2027, it would increase deficits by about $600 billion. There are other concerns. The growth rates that some folks are assuming are astronomically high, like multiples more than anybody else is assuming. And there are a lot of expirations built into this tax cut and this overall bill that are highly unlikely to happen. Those on tips, those on seniors, those on overtime. Once they're in there, they get very entrenched. So if they were to be extended, which is what is driving this bill now, an extension of old tax cuts, that would add another $2 trillion to the price tag. So not good on the fiscal front, no matter how you look at it.
And Maya, I'm glad you mentioned economic growth, because one of the criticisms of your organization and those who look at this and say that this legislation, if enacted and signed by the president, would increase deficits and debt, say, well, you're underestimating the economic growth potential in here. Evaluate that.
Yes, they are, because they like to rely on the magic growth fairy out there, which is something we always pretend will solve the problems, and they don't. It's the same people who said the tax cuts would pay for themselves last time, which they most certainly didn't. And sometimes they'll point to, oh, revenues were higher than we'd expected. Well, that's because we had inflation, which accounted for pretty much all of those higher revenues, along with 1 year right when we were coming out of COVID. We hear this time and time again. You know, it's the magic numbers of growth is going to cure this. But if you look at a whole host of outside experts who've estimated the growth on this tax bill, it ranges from about negative $50 billion to about $700 billion that you could get from growth. That number could be negative because the debt effects are so damaging they might outweigh some of the growth effects from the tax cuts. But the House Budget Committee has been assuming, so negative 50 to 700, they're assuming about $2.6 trillion in growth, many multiples of what any outside estimator thinks is likely. And so I wish you could cut taxes and that would generate more revenue than you had before. Then every time we needed money, we would just cut more taxes. But we got to be realistic. Growth will be helped by tax cuts and harmed by the additional debt. Most people think it will be very minor, whatever growth we see. And overall, we need to start paying for the things we want to spend at the governmental level. So we've got to raise revenue, we got to cut spending, but we can't pretend it's going to magically fix itself.
And Maya, I want you to listen to Kevin Hassett, a top economic advisor to President Trump, about future spending cuts that are on the way. Let's listen.
The bottom line is that there's a lot of spending reduction in this bill, and President Trump met with the Freedom Caucus guys, who are the toughest guys in the House on spending, and they came out and voted for the bill. And the reason is that there's a lot of spending reduction in this bill, but also there's going to be more spending reduction coming week after week after week because of the work of OMB and DOGE.
Maya?
Well, I'm not sure what Kevin's referring to as a lot of spending cuts. Over the time period that we're looking at, the budget window, there'll be $86 trillion in government spending. 86 trillion. This bill aspires to cut about 2 trillion. DOGE has over about 100 billion, and much of that hasn't been verified. So we are not talking about much more than a rounding error in terms of savings. This is not a lot of savings, and it is dwarfed by the overall new borrowing. So this will add to the debt over the next decade. There's really no credible, outside of the people who are pushing for this bill, sort of impartial scorer who thinks that this would save money. It's going to end up causing us to borrow trillions more at a time, where we really should be looking for those savings, much more than just 2 trillion out of 86, particularly if you want to cut taxes.
Maya McGinnis, Committee of Responsible Federal Budget. Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Major.
President Trump gathered with top buyers of his cryptocurrency at his golf club in Virginia last night. His family's use of the meme coin has raised ethical and legal concerns because of how much money it makes the president and his family businesses personally. CBS News political investigative producer Madeline May joins me now. It's so great to have you with us, Madeline. To help my audience, help the audience wrap their mind around this dinner that the president attended, help us understand what this coin is, how the Trump family businesses make money off of it, and why this dinner was a way for that process to get even more amplified.
Trumpcoin is a crypto token that people can buy on an online marketplace. So in the same way that you might be familiar with Bitcoin,
okay,
Trumpcoin is similar to that, except that Trumpcoin is a lot more volatile in price, and that's why people describe it as a meme coin. So the president has sold sneakers and he's sold Bibles, but he also sells this crypto token. And it's different than Bitcoin, and it's different than other cryptocurrencies because the president's family benefits directly financially from this coin, and it's heavily branded by him.
And it benefits when the price goes up, and it benefits when there's any transaction on the buy or sell side. Is that right?
So several companies associated with the president own a majority stake in Trumpcoin, which means that when the value of the coin increases, the Trump family's value and net worth also increases. And there's also transaction fees associated with buying and selling the coin. So every time somebody buys or sells Trump coin, the Trump family and other backers are making money. We talked to one analytics firm that said the Trump family and other backers have probably made more than $300 million since January off of Trump coin.
Who is Donald Quinby, and was he there last night?
Donald Quinby is the chief financial officer of a freight trucking company, and their company specializes in moving goods between Mexico and the United States. That business has been pretty severely impacted by the president's evolving tariff strategy. And so what Donald decided to do was, and his company decided to do, was buy $2 million of Trump coin in order to get the president's attention. And specifically, they're advocating for free and fair trade. And they're hoping that by making this purchase, the president would pay attention and they could possibly shift things in their favor. That investment actually was not enough to get them invited to the gala that happened this week, but they have, according to SEC filings we looked at, they have $20 million they're willing to spend in order to get the president's attention through buying Trump coin.
So very quickly, even though this person wasn't at the gala, he thought it was a way to get the president's attention, and we might fairly conclude others who did buy enough Trump coin to attend that gala thought as well.
The Trump Gala this week was an invite-only dinner at the President's Virginia luxury golf course. And so the 220 top holders of Trump coin got to attend this swanky dinner, and that was attended by the president. On average, it looks like attendees spent $1 million a person to go to that event, meaning that attendees bought $1 million a person of Trumpcoin in order to see the president. And I'd like to talk about one of the attendees in particular, whose
Very
name,
quickly.
His name's Justin Sun, and he's a Chinese crypto billionaire who was recently investigated by the SEC, and those investigations were dropped under the Trump administration, and he's now the top holder of Trumpcoin.
Fascinating. I'm glad you included that. Madeline May, thank you very, very much. The escalating feud between President Trump and Harvard. Our political reporter panel joins me next to assess the administration's most recent attempt to block Harvard from enrolling international students. Lots of implications there, potentially. That's next right here on America Decides. Welcome back to the final episode of America Decides. A federal judge has temporarily halted the Trump administration's attempt to block Harvard from enrolling international students. The university filed a lawsuit this morning in federal court, as it had to, accusing the Trump administration of violating, among other things, the First Amendment. I want to bring in our political reporter panel, Sabrina Rodriguez, national political reporter, The Washington Post, Tyler Kendall, Washington correspondent for Bloomberg. Both are dying to talk about tariffs and all sorts of other things, but let's talk about Harvard first. Sabrina, I want to play you sound and the audience sound from the president in the Oval Office this afternoon about Harvard. Let's listen.
Billions of dollars has been paid to Harvard. How ridiculous is that? Billions. And they have $52 billion as an endowment. They have $52 billion. And this country is paying billions and billions of dollars and then gives student loans and they have to pay back the loans. So Harvard's going to have to change its ways.
The reason I'm playing that sound is because I know the lawyers working for Harvard are jotting every one of those words down, saying to the federal court, and I'm sure in a filing that is being written this afternoon, the president is singling out a university irrespective of applicable federal law. He's just calling us out. He wants Harvard to change its ways, specifically, no other grievance, but these things about money and federal support in the past.
Yes, and this is not the first action that Trump has taken against Harvard. We've already seen a month ago, Trump was talking about how he wants the IRS to take away Harvard's tax-exempt status. We've seen him, want to freeze billions of dollars in federal funds. So this is just the latest escalation, and we're seeing it really squarely on Harvard. He's attacked a lot of different universities, but we've seen it squarely on Harvard because Harvard is forcefully fighting back. And we've seen now multiple lawsuits, come back, responding to the Trump administration. So that's the kind of fight that Trump likes to have.
And Tyler, I'm going to give you a full, wide-open lane on tariffs, but just very quickly, part of the context here is international students pay the highest tuition rate. And private universities, public universities, love to attract international students for that very reason.
Right, and this really could have a chilling effect. Now, of course, the ban's in place, but we should say it's temporary. There's going to be another court hearing on a longer-term injunction on May 29th, but about 27% of Harvard's student body is made up of international students. We've actually already started to see a shift in some of the government statistics. Major, if you look at those that came into the United States in April, on a student visa, that is down 11% from the year before. So it sort of plays into this broader idea, this broader trend. And as Sabrina was mentioning, when it particularly comes to Harvard, there's already been this slew of other actions that we've been watching, freezing the funds, the tax-exempt status. In fact, we had on Bloomberg television today, the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent saying that President Trump does intend to move forward with withholding that tax-exempt status from Harvard University, saying that they don't qualify for that federal tax benefit.
Also worth noting today, Hong Kong announced that it would be open to students from Harvard feeling distressed by this. And part of the argumentation against policies like this is possible brain drain in the United States, the best and the brightest not coming here, going to places like sympathetic Hong Kong, China, etc.
Yeah. No, this hugely benefits other countries. I mean, the reality is, it's interesting because often when you hear Trump talk about immigrants, he has talked about, the best and the brightest. And, oh, yes, the United States should be accepting those who are going to help, advance technology in this country. Well, those are the kinds of students that are attending Harvard University. Right. So by blocking them, and whether it goes through the court system and ultimately students are still able to apply to come to Harvard, a lot of students right now that are abroad and are looking at what's happening in the United States are going to think twice when they see the State Department revoking visas when they see Trump attacking these major universities. So even if they're allowed to in the future, I think a lot of international students are going to be thinking twice.
Tyler, tariffs, run with it.
Okay, well, today we saw President Trump really take a big escalation when it came particularly to the European Union.
A new escalation,
A new escalation saying potentially we could see 50% tariffs. That seemed to sort of set the tone ahead of some pretty highly anticipated trade talks today between the European Union's chief trade negotiator and USTR Jamieson Greer. Now, we haven't gotten a readout of what that conversation looked like, but we're going to be watching it closely since President Trump has said that no progress has been made when it comes to talking with the European Union. And we have to keep in mind, there's a lot of different complicating factors here. One, the EU is negotiating as a bloc. That means all 27 member states ultimately have to agree. And that really complicates the second factor here, which is that when it comes to the European Union, the Trump administration is really demanding that they address what they like to call those non-tariff barriers. So think regulations, lacks IP protections, but in the case of the EU, it's really the VAT value-added tax and also digital services taxes that can hit U.S. tech companies particularly hard. So those are some of the themes that we're watching to see whether or not there could be some sort of concession there, but the EU's really said that those taxes are pretty much off the table. I'll quickly add that our reporting at Bloomberg does tell us that earlier this week, the EU did float an updated proposal. It could have seen trade barriers coming back down to zero on certain products like agricultural goods and industrial goods. But at the end of the day, that wasn't really enough to move the needle.
Sabrina, your take.
I think the hardest thing right now is for a lot of the countries that are really trying to negotiate with the United States in good faith, it's hard to know what exactly it is that Trump wants and what exactly it is, because they'll have conversations with administration officials who say one thing, and then you hear Trump in a press conference say something completely different. But the reality is, you know, he put that 90-day pause on the sweeping tariffs. We're approaching that. You know, we're halfway there. You know, it's early July that we'll see that lift. We have not seen many of these trade deals that he said were going to come together. And you and I have talked about this before, but I covered trade in the first administration, covered for over a year negotiations between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada. That was one trade deal that took over a year to negotiate. So the idea that they're going to get all these trade deals done in the next roughly 45 days is really tough to envision because of just this moving target like Tyler was talking about.
Sabrina Rodriguez, Tyler Kendall, thanks so very much. Both excellent. Really appreciate it. Elon Musk said this week he's going to be spending less of his money on politics, but we have yet to see him spend less time in Trump's orbit. That's next, right here on America Decides. Welcome back. Elon Musk. We've been saying that name so often here in Washington for months. He said this week he's pulling back from politics, at least from a financial perspective. Listen.
In terms of political spending, I'm going to do a lot less in the future.
And why is that?
I think I've done enough.
That doesn't mean that Musk will not be, or still isn't, a visible presence in politics. After those comments, the tech billionaire made appearances in the Oval Office this week, and not once but twice on Capitol Hill. I want to bring in Tina Nguyen. She's a senior reporter for The Verge. What is Elon Musk and the Doge of it all after this enormous attention that I think we all justifiably placed on the world's richest man being so close to the President of the United States and unveiling and unleashing this effort to reduce federal spending and the scope and size of the federal workforce?
I think it's going to have a huge reverberating impact both on the Trump administration, the federal government at large for sure, but the Trump administration as well. There was an Atlantic article that came out this week that detailed these screaming matches inside the White House between Elon and the rest of the administration. Apparently, Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, got so heated by it that Trump started respecting him for the first time. But the idea that Elon is impeding on everyone else's territory, preventing them from implementing their agenda, and more importantly, preventing Trump's populist allies from doing whatever it is they want to do is a big power tussle, as it were. So you're definitely going to have a lot of resentment from the administration and the people who remained in the administration against the Doge implants, but it's not like Elon didn't come in there and take what he wanted, which was access to these government data frames, all of this infrastructure, all of this personal information about Americans. Like, that is the big thing he ultimately wanted.
Right. And when we think about the achieved savings so far, the idea initially, their words, not mine, not yours, $2 trillion, then $1 trillion. Advertised on the Doge X account, it's $160 billion. What's been verified so far, near as I can tell, is something between $2 billion and $8 billion. How should we evaluate that? Is that sweeping? Is that super important? Or is that just the beginning of things?
I think the numbers are not quite important yet.
Okay.
It's only been, what, 130 days? That's
Right.
the legal limit that Elon could be working as a special government employee.
Right.
What you're going to want to hear from them is like what the cumulative number is over time. Right now, you can't really adequately say, okay, here's what is cut at this moment. You know, costs balloon over time, costs disappear over time. And ultimately what you're not looking for is a hard number, but like, is government going to be effective? What happens when government is not effective? Is the government not effective here on purpose? That's ultimately the real impact of Doge.
I want to play for you sound with an interview that Elon gave to CNBC this week with David Faber about criticism or conversation about the overall cumulative effect, large or small, of Doge. Let's listen.
You're about efficiency. I mean, that would take an act of Congress, obviously, to really make changes of the significance I'm talking about.
First of all, so I think in our opinion, we've created a $160 billion delta, FY25 to FY26, very significant. We are advisors. We're not kings here.
I get it.
So why are you attacking this, given that we've made so much progress?
You mean not me?
Okay.
Not me. I'm not attacking. I'm just asking questions.
Yeah. So 160 billion, not verified, aspirational possibly, but this idea that we're not kings, going back to our earlier conversation, some of the administration thought he was trying to roll like a king.
I mean, when you're a Silicon Valley billionaire who is the richest man in the world and has what my colleagues call like a reality distortion field around him, when you're a person who literally has memed the value of Tesla into the stratosphere and become the richest man in the world just because you have a giant fan base, of course you're going to think you're a king, and of course you're going to think that the government is going to fall down to whatever it is you want. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending how you see it, the federal government is this big, lumbering, slow, difficult to change entity. And that's what happens when you have the move bats and break things mentality crush up against a federal government that's been built like this for 100 years.
And as you said, Tina, the thing to watch, not just today, but 2 months from now, 6 months from now, 12 months from now, what did Elon learn and gain from all the access to all the data and all the government databases?
And I honestly think that it will be a lot more interesting to track the data aspect of it rather than just the money aspect of it. I recently reported for The Verge that the Librarian of Congress and the head of the U.S. Copyright Offices, when they were removed, it was actually a move from the tech right. My sources believe it was Elon Musk and the crypto/AI czar David Sachs. And what they saw was this opportunity for them to come in, take all of the copyrighted information that is available in the Library of Congress and start feeding it into their AI.
Keep an eye on
Absolutely,
that. And we will, and we'll bring you back when you have more fresh reporting on that, Tina Nguyen. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. From Obama's hope and change to RFK Jr. and MAHA, let's make America healthy again. Coming up, how the best-selling author who brands herself Food Babe has become a leader in the Trump administration's health renewal efforts. That's next here on America Decides. Welcome back. At the White House yesterday, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. released the Make America Healthy Again Commission report. Among the MAHA activists in attendance, influencer known as the Food Babe. New York Times piece looks into Vani Hari's shift from an Obama ally to Trump supporter. For more on this story, I'm joined by New York Times food culture correspondent Kim Severson. Kim, it's great to have you with us. Talk about this transformation.
It's actually anybody who's watched the food industry for the last decade or so is kind of jaw dropped at this transformation. So you have basically the food issues that had been owned by the progressive left for many years: organic food, school food reform, limiting pesticides, limiting food dyes, is now actually owned by MAHA, owned by the conservative right. And Vani Hari, the Food Babe, has been sort of making herself part of this world for since 2012. And I remember her as an Obama Democrat at the Charlotte Democratic Convention. And she's completely flipped and now is, as I said in my New York Times story, the Taylor Swift of the MAHA moms.
Was she disillusioned by something that the Obama administration did or didn't do?
I think that she, she's always been very singularly focused. GMOs was something that she wanted to get on food labels. She was campaigning for President Obama, who promised to do that, and he didn't. That was one strike. And she also went hard against Subway that had a dough conditioner in their bread that was also famously used in yoga mats. And that's kind of how she made her name, by chewing a yoga mat on her blog and saying, get this out. Well, Michelle Obama embraced Subway when they became part of her Better Food movement. And, she was trying to get any and everybody to come on board and make food healthier and fresher in her Let's Move campaign. So those were a couple of things that I think disappointed her. I think she's always been skeptical of government, but when she really dove in and she got, she kind of didn't get what she wanted out of the Democrats, she then has found that she's getting what she wants now out of MAHA.
Kim, it's a hard answer, but does she have a science-based rooting in her criticisms of the food industry?
Well, that's the big issue with her, right? So she is a computer science major. She was a high school debate champion. And she says, I'm not a scientist, but she researches. So her research is, as we all know now, we live in an era of do your own research. That's essentially her scientific basis. She's certainly right about a lot of things. Some things over the course of time she's been wrong about, and certainly the science-based community has come after her very hard, especially after her 2015 book, and said she was, peddler of scare tactics and pseudoscience. I think that the criticism against her is that she would read an ingredient that sounded like a chemical, that was a chemical, and go after it and say, do you know, riboflavin is in your food, and that's actually B12 or something like that. Certainly now that they want to get food dyes out of processed food, right. She's got some traction, right? Because that is something that she's been talking about for a long time. So it's a very mixed bag.
Very mixed bag, but an interesting example of culture, politics, nutrition, all circling around one another, and now front and center in the MAHA Trump administration. Kim Severson, New York Times, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. Pleasure. That does it for today. And importantly, that does it for America Decides. This show relaunched under that name, America Decides, in 2023, as we here at CBS News ramped up our coverage of the presidential election. We traveled to the Iowa State Fair, the debates, the early primary states, the political conventions, more debates, election night 2024, and the first 100-plus days of the new Trump administration. We have a new show starting Tuesday after the holiday weekend. The Takeout will debut in this time slot. It's a project, some of you know, near and dear to my heart, a nightly show building off the podcast, The Takeout, that I hosted for 8 years. You'll find the same political reporting and analysis, as well as more in-depth conversations about the culture of politics and the politics of culture. We hope you'll join us. The Daily Report is coming up next, right here on CBS News 24/7.